What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some new details and information about everything from combat to the investigations for Warhammer 40k Dark Heresy, Owlcat Games' upcoming CRPG, of course. And while I've been following along with it so far, the people who I believe purchased their founder packs and stuff, and then at least some other people as well, will get access to the alpha coming up on December 16th, which will be the first hands-on experience people have had with it outside the dev team, of course. Now, this information that I am bringing you is from a presentation that Owlcat gave to about, I think, 20 or so creators, myself included, obviously, that went over a presentation of game mechanics, combat, things that change, actually seeing the game be played, that kind of thing. And while it was not a hands-on presentation, it did give me a lot of information alongside an AMA afterwards that allowed people to ask questions. We've got a lot to go over here, but while I can freely talk about this stuff ahead of the December 16th drop for the alpha, what I cannot do is show you the footage from that presentation. That was an internal testing build and will be different from the one that we get on the 16th via the alpha. Now, for the sake of this video, I'm obviously then going to just have some things like the previously released trailers and stuff rolling in the background, so it's not integral you actually watch the video for this one or anything. You should feel free to just listen, as the stuff I will actually be showing you will be after the 16th, once I've had my hands on the alpha itself. And so this video is going to be broken up into some general things about the breakdown and showcase itself, followed by the combat section, and then the questions from the AMA, and then I'll kind of give my own thoughts on the whole thing afterwards. So, the presentation that was provided was fairly early in the game. You are going to an area to help a member of the Adepta Sororitas with an issue, specifically a missing person, and you are being sent here by the Lord Inquisitor. But that's not the only thing you'll be doing, because you'll actually meet another Inquisitor, Inquisitor Millicentilia, who also needs help with essentially the same kind of problems. There are people missing, and you need to get to the bottom of it. Now, this portion of the presentation was focused primarily on the investigation systems, and so that's a lot of the info I have here, but there were a couple of other interesting notes. For starters, as we are no longer a rogue trader and our wealth is not infinite, basically, this time around, vendors will behave pretty much the way vendors would normally work for every other game. You will have currency that you'll have available to spend on things in the moment, as opposed to the profit factor system of Rogue Trader. What is intact, however, is the reputation system. So in Rogue Trader, you would trade goods with those factions and you'll get reputation back. And while you are not trading goods for reputation here, there is a reputation system, and some items from those factions will not be available to you unless you've built up the reputation for them, and I thought that was interesting. Now, from the vendor, they moved on to the investigation scene, and the investigations play out more or less how you would probably expect, but the two things I wanted to note are that it's a slightly more cinematic experience than you would expect. There's a lot of little cinematics to things, especially when you interact with a point of interest or part of the investigation. Sometimes there are cinematics to show you those things in full and kind of get you a little more immersed in that experience. And I think that stuff combined with the full voice acting this time around is probably going to sit pretty well with most people. Otherwise, though, we're basically gathering information and searching for Millicentilia's contact. As this is relatively early in the game, this forms one of our companion meetups, and throughout the course of this presentation, alongside the companions that were already with us, they picked up Larthir, the Aldari companion, alongside Cog, the Ogren. Larthir being suitably haughty about everything, and Cog being extremely effective in combat from what I've seen, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, the investigations, again, basically you just kind of go around to points of interest, pick them up, which will give you clues. Sometimes you can interact with those more through the investigation menu that they've shown off previously via one of their Steam updates, actually, and this is where you are going to get more information about these things, go over your clues, and this is actually the screen from which individual companions can chime in and add in their own observations to things. This is important because companions like Epione, I just call her EpiPen, the sort of doctor-type character we'll have with us, is able to give you more information about, medical things, body parts you find laying around, that kind of stuff. But even Hamar, one of our sort of more combat-oriented companions with his combat experience is able to give you important information about the state in which you find bodies, things like that. So companions are important. They will chime in on investigations. But speaking of those investigations, a really big part of that is definitely the skill check side of things, to the point where I would say having a character who is like a dedicated skill monkey or somebody to pass skill checks for you is going to be important. The reason for this is that these things are everywhere in relation to your investigation, and the amount of information that you find determines, of course, what you can do with said information. And so to that end, there are actually several new skill checks and the like. There were things like investigation, wits, inspection, that kind of thing. And so while some of those I think might have just been a little more dialogue related in particular, essentially there are going to be different types of skills and the like, and we'll get a little more into those during the combat section because they changed how some things work there. But the main thing I want to get across is that skill checks and companions seem to be playing a really big role in the more, I guess you could call it, social aspect of the investigations and actually trying to puzzle out what went wrong. But one of the, I would say, better AMA questions, actually, and one I'm going to go ahead and sort of roll into this part of the video, is actually that, were they concerned with investigations feeling bad if, you're constantly getting the answers wrong and stuff like that? Basically, what are the consequences of this situation? And I think the answer to this question actually sums up the investigation system really well, and the gist of it is basically that you are the judge here. You are deciding what happened, officially speaking, and who gets the blame for that thing. And so no one's really going to double down on you being absolutely wrong or anything like that in the moment. And while there are consequences to these things that will obviously come up later, as whether or not you track down the correct answer, so to speak, there is a sort of correct answer. You can get to the bottom of the people behind these things and their motivations if you, actually pore over the notes you'll be finding, read them, come to conclusions which you will be able to pick for yourself, including just, several options of what was available in the moment. And to that end, all of that is kind of building somewhere, but it's not going to come to a head where everyone's just like, this thing is empirically incorrect and you should feel bad about it, I guess, is what the point is. And so it's less about being right or wrong and more about how you choose to navigate the situation, especially when it comes to things like the reports that are headed back to the Inquisition. And while that's a little vague, I admit the idea of it is very intriguing to me, and one of the more interesting things about the presentation and this game as a whole, because I think this specifically is where this game is likely going to have the most opportunity to set itself apart from every other game. I think if they nail this specifically, it will make or break the feel of this CRPG in relation to all of the other CRPGs out there, including Owlcat's own body of work even. But speaking of their body of work, another thing that unfortunately I have to describe rather than show, but will come up in the alpha video, is that the work they have put into making all of the visuals more crisp has definitely paid off. This is another thing that they've actually shown off a little bit via a Steam update previously. So if anything, I just kind of wanted to confirm this here. The graphical jump from even just Rogue Trader to Dark Heresy is honestly pretty noticeable. Environments and stuff are way more detailed. Individual characters and models are much more sharp, which is important actually, because despite the isometric camera for this, you will actually via things like cinematics and things be kind of getting on the ground level with these characters fairly regularly. And at the very least, for someone like myself who has played all of their games, it was noticeable even just from this presentation. Things look a lot better. And to that end, the UI actually also is looking pretty great. So they, of course, still have the stylized UI that they always like to put in their games. This time around, thanks to the investigations and our role as an acolyte of the Inquisition, everything has like this sort of tabulated folder vibe to it, a sort of case file type situation, and I thought that was especially interesting. Now, from here, I want to talk about combat a little bit. They did give us a demonstration of combat, and there's a few things that stood out to me straight away. Those being things like verticality, concentration abilities, the new morale system, the armor bar, and some other stuff. But let's take it one step at a time. So, concentration abilities, what's this about? Well, basically some enemies will have a concentration effect in combat. This will be things like, in the example of the presentation anyway, executing a hostage. When that character's turn rolls around, the concentration effect will take effect and they will then take that action. So the point of the concentration is that you'll know what they are going to do if it gets around to their turn, and you'll have until their turn to stop that thing. So if you wanted to save the hostages here, you would need to do something to interrupt that concentration, which can be things like a grenade, which will interrupt concentration without any sort of check, as you would probably expect. And then there are other abilities that actually specifically break concentration as well, such as a Psyker ability that they showed off called Assail from Larthier. Now, another really interesting system was the new Armor and Critical Hits system. So Armor is effectively like a second health bar here, and I'm at the very least a little cautious about this system because if people remember, many games have done something like this previously to mixed effect. Notably, Divinity Original Sin 2 in the CRPG space has like a physical magical armor system that acts as a second health bar of sorts. And much like that, the armor bar here is actually protecting you from getting injuries to specific limbs. Whereas in DOS 2 it would protect you from status effects, but it's a similar concept. So once your armor is gone, or the armor durability in combat I should say is gone, once you get hit you'll have to pass checks in order to not take injuries. Injuries that you sustain will of course affect your combat effectiveness in the moment, which can then go on to affect things like morale. Another thing the armor system is actually going to protect you from though is critical hits. Critical hits are effectively like aimed shot, allowing you to aim at specific portions of a body, typically at a hit to your chance to hit, but if they go through and there's no armor in the way, you'll injure those characters, or more than likely injure them in the case of a failed check anyway, at which point they will take penalties to their combat effectiveness. So that's something people will have to play around. But I've mentioned morale a couple times there, so what is that about? So morale is different from Rogue Trader's momentum for sure, namely that it is a slightly more individual thing, but it is still important on a team level. So morale is going to affect a lot of stuff. In fact, one thing I noticed is that a significant amount of abilities had morale playing an effect in their calculations. And in fact, that's something kind of going on with a lot of different skills. Many of the skills and items you'll be using take those skills rather than like base attribute stats into effect when they are doing their calculations and stuff. And while I don't have all the details, so I don't want to spend some time on it, it does actually look to be, importantly different from Rogue Trader outside of the basic weapon skill, ballistic skill, stuff like that. But my point is the calculation should be a little bit different. However, in the case of the morale system, this is going to allow them to do things like enable victory by shattering an enemy's morale. An example they gave here was that the commander of the group was marked as the commander, and once they are dead, the enemy starts losing morale every turn until it drops low enough for it to be shattered, at which point you just win the fight. However, that's just one example. There is potentially even more stuff going on here, and ways that they can use that morale system to do interesting things. In fact, another sort of familiar one that's already been changed a bit is the desperate measures. So morale in Rogue Trader came with heroic moments or desperate measures based on where your momentum was. However, the morale system here, if it gets low enough, can enable something like the Desperate Measures system, but where it was pure benefit in Rogue Trader, it's actually more of a trade-off here because Desperate Measures will give you access to powerful abilities, yes, but at a permanent debuff as well for the rest of combat. So simply put, the morale system and the changes they've made here look to be definitely very important to how things play out, and yet that's actually not everything. They also are adding some verticality to things. In particular, there will be spaces that you can move up and down onto ramps, scaffolding, all sorts of environmental places. And this does two things, I would say. For starters, it's going to inherently make a lot of combat situations more interesting because there is a level of sort of up and down and line of sight that is more prevalent here than it was Rogue Trader, though some of this stuff was certainly in Rogue Trader. It just looks to be more of a big thing here. If anything, I would say they kind of just iterated on the ideas more than anything else. However, another thing this does is make a lot of the environments that you'll be traversing and moving around in a hair more complicated. I'm curious to see how the wider audience will take to these things, as the areas themselves seem to be a bit larger and I could see people getting a little more easily lost in these things, but we'll simply wait and see how it pans out for all of that. Now, the other portion of this video that I wanted to cover last is the AMA. What have people been asking about? So, just a few questions I thought were especially noteworthy here. I'm sure some of these other creators will also make videos about stuff, so I don't necessarily want to go over every single one, but a great one was whether or not you could skip the prologue. People didn't really enjoy playing through the prologue every single time in Rogue Trader. The short answer here is no, though. The total length of the game was asked. Truth be told, they were not sure, especially since what is going to be a really big factor for playtime here is how long people spend on the investigations. You can just fly through them if you're not super concerned about the outcome, but if you want to pore over every bit of evidence, that's obviously going to take a significantly longer amount of time. But all in all, they're shooting for around 80 hours, which has kind of been their hallmark point for all of their games at this point, so we'll simply have to see what happens there. But truth be told, they don't have a set-in-stone number at the moment either. Another great question was about the game's morality system. So Rogue Trader has a morality system. Iconoclast, dogmatic, heretical, that kind of thing. It's a little different here because we are working directly for the Inquisition, like that is what we are doing as the role-playing start point. So it's more about differing viewpoints of the Inquisition's ideology, you know, things like a traditionalist or a radical, that kind of thing. And so morality is present, it will play a role, it's going to have some effects, unique options, stuff like that. They weren't really ready to give details, but it is going to be in there. So that will be interesting for sure. And then another great question was somebody asking about the companion start points. This being in reference to the fact that in previous Owlcat games, each of your companions has like a minimum level at which you meet them, and that was when you could start customizing them, which meant their levels before that were kind of set in stone. And so something people have wanted for a long time is the ability to customize these guys from their level 1 starting point, like, you know, lock in some basic points that can't be changed, like their origin and background, that kind of stuff, and then allow customization directly from level 1 to better sort of customize exactly what their loadout is. This is something Owlcat is workshopping. It is not currently final yet, but it sounds like that is essentially the route they want to go, where they want you to be able to pick up a companion and there's a sort of locked-in starting point that you cannot change, but then you're free to level them up to the point at which you would be picking them up. So whatever level you're supposed to get them at, allowing you to customize those in between levels. And that is a fantastic change if it actually makes it in there. But again, that is not final right now. And if you're wondering why that's not final, I mean, just off the top of my head, I would imagine there could be scenarios where you need a companion to do a very specific thing, or they have balanced around you having a party that has like guaranteed abilities at a certain point. And, you know, if you are going to have the ability to change that, it could cause unforeseen problems and unique circumstances. And while I'm not saying that is a thing, or it couldn't be worked around, I'm just pointing out that there are things you have to keep in mind for that specifically. But I think that's just about all as far as actual information goes. So to share some of my own thoughts about this, the things that stood out to me the most were the combat changes alongside the level of detail and interactability with the environment. Now, some of that environmental interaction is a necessity with the way the investigation systems are going to work. And while I love CRPGs generally, yes, I think the investigation system in particular is this game's chance to really stand out in a crowded sea of CRPGs. And it looks like that's probably going to be the system that is the most unique thing this game has going for it. Whereas everything else, like the combat changes, look like a great iteration on the combat system that was started with Rogue Trader. That's something I won't know for sure until I have my hands on the game and can actually play it for myself, but it's a good starting point for sure. Another thing I liked that I hope carries over to the full game at least is that in the presentation here, it really did seem like every companion that was with you had like a dedicated role to play. And some of that is due to like itemization and stuff that's probably not worth getting into the details of right here. But basically every companion had like some unique things going for them and how they interacted with stuff that made the combat side of things also look pretty interesting as well. But I suppose a lot of that will come down to just how much you like the system at play in Rogue Trader, if anything. I was also pleasantly surprised by how sort of interactive some of the investigation stuff was. Because, like, there is an element of, yes, you're just looking for things to point and click on, get some information, and move on. And it looks, to me at least, that it's pretty obvious they made an attempt here to make that a more interactive experience with, like, the little cutscenes and the way that information is presented to you to try to keep you a little bit more involved. Now, how successful that winds up being, we'll certainly see, but it's definitely off to a good start from what I saw in this presentation. And with that in mind, I would say my chief concern for this game right now is whether or not they can, squash as many bugs as possible ahead of the game's eventual release. Like, obviously they've got the alpha and beta phase to go. They're just starting like playtesting and stuff in full. So there's a lot to go, but it's also no secret that all of Owlcat games basically have been pretty buggy. And my hope here is that they can, with all of the things they've learned up to this point, start putting some real emphasis on getting that stuff under control before launch, because they are absolutely getting a bit of a reputation for having games that people need to wait a year or two for all of the patches and stuff to be out to be in a more playable state. And while there's some element of truth to that pretty much always for every game, that is an issue that I hope they tackle head on here. But the rest of it, unsurprisingly, just stuff I'd need to see more of. The investigation system seems promising, but I could also see issues where that might not be as impactful as you might want it to be, but that just depends on the implementation in the full game. And then there's other stuff that I just don't have any information at all about, like, individual companions and their full stories, that kind of thing, how impactful any of that winds up being, stuff like that that's inherent to a CRPG that without playing it in full, you just don't know the answer to. So all in all, a lot of really good information came out of this presentation and AMA. I certainly hope people got some new information out of this video on top of that. If you're looking for more info about this game, with the alpha dropping on the 16th, I will have some stuff to actually show you for it relatively soon. And so if you're interested in all that, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, stick around and hang out for the rest of it, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.